It's just obscene. It's absolutely obscene, but is exactly what you expect from these people. They are completely classless. And Trump says that British troops will always be alongside the United States. Well, keep going like this and you'll soon find out we won't be.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Even though there's a lot of domestic news happening in the US right now, we're going to focus on the international space with so much happening between Russia and Ukraine, especially with this trilateral meeting that took place over the weekend. So just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So today I am joined by Kyiv-based journalist. He's also a foreign policy and security expert, Jimmy Rushton. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.
And Jimmy, as the audience can see, and if you are listening to this, just to describe, Jimmy's got quite a few layers on for this for this show. You, of course, are based in Kyiv. There has been a massive Russian attack on Ukraine's energy grid in the last few days. About 1.2 million properties are without electricity. Specifically, around 60% of homes in Kyiv are without power. The temperatures have dropped to the minuses. So, Jimmy, can you kind of walk me through what the vibe is on the ground in Ukraine?
Sure. It's very, very cold. In fact, it's not quite as cold as it has been. The temperatures are going to be hovering around freezing in the next coming week. Although today it's about -10 outside. It has got as low as -20. And as you can probably imagine, when you've got no heating and no power at those sort of temperatures, it's extremely cold. Temperatures in my apartment today are hovering around about 8-9 degrees, hence the slightly Arctic apparel that I'm sporting right now. And yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult. It's most difficult for people on Kyiv's left bank, which is on the other side of the Dnipro, where conditions are even worse than they are here. I'm in the centre of the city. We get maybe 3-4 hours of power a day. That's enough to heat water for a hot shower, to raise the temperature by a few degrees and do washing and what have you. But on the left bank, there have been properties that have been without power, without water, and without heating for days at a time. And that is, in temperatures that are dropping to -20, that's life-threatening conditions.
We're entering our 4th year of this war in February, Jimmy. So when you're walking around, or I'm not sure how often you're even going out, but when you're speaking to people on the ground in Kyiv, are you finding that Ukrainians have grown even more frustrated in the last few weeks because of this power outage? And on that note, are they more willing to be making sacrifices or concessions? Of course, this is the Kremlin's goal, to wear Ukrainians down.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea behind these strikes is to create domestic political opposition in Ukraine and to undermine the Ukrainian government. I don't think that's working. From my perspective, people blame the Russians for these strikes. Obviously, they don't blame the government. There is criticism of the government in some ways, and especially, for example, the regional government, for example, Kyiv city authorities. Klitschko is the mayor of Kyiv. There's been criticism of him. There has been some criticism of Zelensky as well. But it's really within the context of, this is a war that's been going on for many years. We should be better prepared. It's not in the kind of context of, this is terrible, we need to surrender. Because most Ukrainians understand that even if you gave Russia exactly what they wanted or what they're asking for today, they're just going to ask for something more tomorrow. And if they agree to pause the war for any amount of time, they're just going to restart it. Ukrainians have been through this since 2014. So it's, there's a quiet determination here, but that shouldn't let me understate the difficulties that a lot of Ukrainians are going through. Because it's conditions of -20, however much solidarity that you have and patriotic spirit, that those are temperatures which are incredibly difficult to bear.
And over the weekend we saw Ukraine, Russia and the United States hold 2 days of talks in Abu Dhabi. This is the first three-way meeting of its kind since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. Now, Ukraine's president called the discussions constructive. US officials have said it was very upbeat, very positive. No formal peace agreement or ceasefire was reached. Key disagreements remain. We assume the main thing that is disagreed, of course, is over this territory in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. All sides have acknowledged that more work needs to be done. So these talks will kick off again on February 1st back in Abu Dhabi. But this was kind of expected, Jimmy, that we really wouldn't have a breakthrough in these trilateral meetings. No deal was set. They, of course, as I said, they'll pick up again on Sunday. But how optimistic are you that a peace deal can be reached through these kind of diplomatic discussions?
I'm not optimistic at all, unfortunately, and I think my level of optimism is reflected by your average Ukrainian in the street and your average Ukrainian soldier fighting on the front line. They don't think that Russia is taking these talks seriously. I don't think the Ukrainian government thinks that Russia is taking these talks seriously. The Ukrainians are participating in these talks because they know they have to keep the Americans on side, because the Americans, unfortunately, seem to believe Putin when he talks about being, wanting to see some form of peaceful settlement. At least when he talks to Trump about this, and the Trump administration about this. When Russia is talking to the Russian people via domestic-focused propaganda, they're very, very different in how they talk and the way that they essentially demand Ukraine's complete capitulation and the subjugation of Ukraine and the removal of any form of Ukrainian independence and national sovereignty. That's ultimately their goal. And that's what the Ukrainian government believes Russia still wants. That's what the Ukrainian people largely believe that Russia still wants. And they're not optimistic of peace coming anytime soon, unfortunately.
And do you think it's ignorant to believe that Russia really does want peace and is going into these discussions with the idea that they want peace, trying to prove to the Ukrainians and the US side that Russia is open to peace, given that while these discussions are taking place, Jimmy, Russia launched its largest overnight aerial attack on Ukraine over the weekend as this trilateral meeting is taking place?
Of course. I mean, I would say it's worse than ignorant. It's incredibly stupid. If Russia genuinely wanted peace, they could stop this war tomorrow. Ukraine is not fighting on Russian territory. They're fighting on their own territory. Russia could simply order a ceasefire. Russia wouldn't even have to withdraw from the areas that they currently occupy because Ukraine doesn't have the ability currently to push them out. They could literally just stop the slaughter tomorrow, and that would be that. There would be some form of political process. But again, the Ukrainians have been pretty honest and realistic about this. They understand that they don't have the ability to kick the Russians out of the current territory that Russia occupies in Ukraine by force. They're not going to give up the territory. They're not going to say, well, this is Russia now. But what they will say is we're going to try and get this territory back by political means if the war ended or there was some form of ceasefire tomorrow. So again, the ball is totally in Russia's court. And the reason why it hasn't stopped is because Russia keeps making these ridiculous territorial demands. They want Ukraine to withdraw from territory which Russia hasn't conquered, which is critical for the defense of the rest of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are not going to do this. And they're partly not going to do this because these security guarantees that the West, the UK, France and America keep talking about, nobody believes that these are genuine or realistic or credible.
And we'll get into the security guarantees in a minute, but I want to get your thoughts. Zelensky, Jimmy, he sent out a call for more air defense weapons in response to these attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. What exactly can the US and these European allies provide Ukraine urgently?
Quite a lot. They can provide them with critical capability, so more Patriot PAC-3 interceptors, which are realistically the only type of air defense that works reliably against Russian ballistic missiles. They can provide them with lower technology capability, so the missiles for NASAMS and for other Ukrainian surface-to-air missile air defense systems. They can provide them with intelligence support. They can provide them with offensive intelligence support, so when the Ukrainians are planning these drone operations deep within Russia, they can provide them with, improved intelligence support. They're already doing this, by the way. The Ukrainian deep strike campaign is aided by Western intelligence, but they could do more of this. They can increase sanctions on Russian industry. They can start seizing the dark fleets, the shadow fleet of oil tankers, which some countries, France seized one the other day. The Americans have seized a couple. I think the UK should start doing this. I think other countries should start doing this because Russia gains a lot of valuable revenue from exporting oil on these ancient tankers, which are often not properly insured and are in very poor state of repair. So even if you don't really care about Ukraine, you should probably think of removing this threat because, these tankers, one of these tankers is going to suffer a critical failure at one point, and that will be an ecological disaster, obviously, because when there's a massive oil spill, it's billions of dollars in environmental remediation. So there's lots of things that they could be doing. Some of the things we're doing, some of the things we could be doing more of. But I understand Zelensky's frustration, and until relatively recently, as he said, and this is public, some of Ukraine's air defense systems had run out of interceptors. So that's one of the reasons why some of these more recent Russian attacks were more successful, is because they didn't have any air defense interceptors to fire at the incoming Russian munitions.
Well, on the note of this frustration, President Zelensky, in his speech in Davos last week, he was clearly quite frustrated with the lack of action from Europe. We haven't really seen him publicly calling out Europe the way he's really been tiptoeing, of course, his language over Donald Trump, continuing to keep this support from the US side, but we haven't seen him really go after the European allies. So I want to read out a few quotes and get your thoughts. This is what he said. He said, "Europe loves to discuss the future, but avoids taking action today. Europe looks lost, trying to convince the US president to change. Europe needs strength. For that, we must act together and act in time. Without action now, there is no tomorrow. Let's end this Groundhog Day." He said, on your note, Jimmy, he said, why can President Trump stop tankers from the shadow fleet and seize oil, but Europe doesn't? So, what kind of action specifically does Zelensky need Europe to start doing, apart from these weapons that we've discussed?
Well, as you said, and as Zelensky said, they could start seizing these shadow fleet tankers. It would be legal under international law because most of them seem to be running false flags, so they're not legitimately flagged under the countries that they say they are, and often they're running false registries, and often they're they're operating in a very dangerous fashion without insurance as well. I think the fundamental core of what Zelensky is saying there is that Europe has a lot of ability to be a true strategic power. Europe is rich. It has capable militaries, not obviously as capable as the United States, but capable compared to almost anyone else. And I think there's this kind of cringe, like a cultural cringe of projecting power. And especially if you look at the Germans, like obvious historical reasons, the Germans have always been reluctant to take that kind of leading strategic role in Europe, especially when it's about power and hard military power. And you can understand this from their perspective because of their history, but I think it's time that they really move on from that and start, understanding that nobody views Germany in that light anymore. And I think a lot of countries would welcome a robust, German foreign policy. And to be fair to Merz, since he's come to power, the Germans have been, they have been better. But I think Europe needs to get a sense of self-confidence. I would say it's to the UK as well. We're constantly worrying about our own irrelevance, but I think it hamstrings us when we worry that we're not relevant and we don't have as much power as we think we do. So therefore we don't do anything. So therefore we become less relevant, and it feels like this kind of vicious cycle. We can just do things. We're a rich country. We still got a relatively powerful military. We can just do things. We can just start seizing Russian shadow fleet tankers, and Russia can't really do anything about that. They can threaten us, but they've been threatening us with nuclear weapons since day one of this full-scale invasion, and Russia knows we have nuclear weapons as well. So those threats are really relatively idle. So yeah, I think it's really about self-confidence, strategic self-confidence. He's right in regards to that there's a lot of talk in Europe, there's a lot of endless conversations about, we need to do something, so let's have a meeting, let's schedule a briefing paper, whatever. Sometimes you just need to act. And I think for him as well, every day in Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers die, Ukrainian cities are bombed, Ukrainian civilians die. So even though Europe is from their perspective, they're moving fast as they can, that still might seem, and that does seem very slow from a Ukrainian perspective.
In response to these attacks on the Ukraine's energy grid, Jimmy, how has the Ukrainian army ramped up their own attacks in response? We mentioned this patriotism, and I can imagine it's still alive and well within the Ukrainian army. I mean, you speak to them quite often, but what we did see was that the Ukraine's military struck another oil refinery in Russia overnight. So are these attacks still being detrimental to the Russian side?
No, absolutely. And the Ukrainian long-range drone program, which they established from basically nothing starting late 2022, has proven extremely effective. They've been hitting a variety of industrial and economic targets within Russia. They've been hitting tankers. They've blown up a number of empty tankers with maritime drones and long-range airborne drones. And yeah, this has been an effective campaign, and it will continue. They've also responded to Russian attacks on Ukrainian power infrastructure by hitting Russian power infrastructure, and there have been large-scale blackouts, including around Moscow at times. So they are, they're fighting back. This is not a one-sided war by any means. The Ukrainians have been giving not quite as good as they've got, but they've been punching well above their weight. Again, this is a war that most Western analysts thought that Russia should be able to win within 3 and 4 weeks, and we're now 4 years into this full-scale war.
Volodymyr Zelensky, he has said in the last week or so that the US security guarantee agreement is 100% ready to be signed, but Kyiv is waiting in Washington to set a time and place to basically sign this. So, I mean, Jimmy, what is really the holdup, do you think? Because the one thing that Ukraine has said, as Zelensky has said, is he wants this signed straight away, but then he wants it ratified through Congress. So he wants it signed through Congress so that, when Trump steps down, when his 4 years is up, governments going forward will respect this agreement, that they'll be there for Ukraine in the event of another invasion down the track. So, I mean, we saw Trump say that security guarantees have been agreed upon by the US side, but is he stalling on this, do you think? Because we know that Ukraine will refuse to give up land, but especially if there are no security agreements in place.
Yes. Here's the problem with security guarantees. Fundamentally, a security guarantee is only of any worth if you believe that if it is, invoked, for example, Article 5, NATO Article 5, is a guarantee that if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will come to the aid of that country. And that is a credible guarantee. That's why the Soviets believed that during the Cold War. That's why Russia believes that now. And that's why overt Russian military threats towards NATO countries remain just that, threats. They haven't bombed logistics hubs in Poland that deliver weapons to Ukraine, despite the fact they threatened to do that multiple times, because they know that if they did that, there would be a response, or they believe that there would be a response, right? So if there are security guarantees to Ukraine, they also have to be credible. And the problem that we have is that since February 2022, one of the main aims of the Americans, the Brits, the French, Germans, etc., has been to avoid escalation, to avoid a full-scale war with Russia. Now, we have to believe that if there's some form of peace deal and Russia agrees to the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine, which they've always said that they're not going to agree to, by the way, but if somehow they agree to French, British troops in Ukraine and that the Americans somehow provide some form of security backstop, probably through air power or what have you, we have to believe for these guarantees to be credible that if Russia then overstepped the mark, started advancing again in parts of Ukraine, that British and French troops would engage Russian troops, and that the Americans would start engaging Russian troops as well. And that would essentially be some form of full-scale war between, or at least a localized war between the United States, Britain, France, and Russia, which is something that they've been trying to avoid since February 2022. I just don't believe it. I don't think a lot of Ukrainians believe it either, which is why, a senior Ukrainian military, Bogdan Kvartovich, who used to be chief of staff of Azov, he wrote recently that the only security guarantee that actually is credible for the Ukrainian state is a strong Ukrainian army. And I agree with him. I think that will always be the most credible security guarantee for Ukraine, because I don't think the Ukrainians can trust any security guarantee that's given to them by the Brits, the French, or the Americans. I for understandable reasons. And I think I think we're operating in this parallel universe where we're pretending that these countries are just going to go to war with Russia in the future, and that everyone just accepts that that's, credible or real or a realistic state of affairs. It's just, I find it very strange, to be honest.
If that's the case, Jimmy, and if you say this is how Ukrainians feel, but potentially if this is how Zelensky and his government feel, are they approaching these negotiations with that in mind, knowing that perhaps this won't happen, perhaps it won't provide the guarantees? And of course, there's always the thought of the fact that the US had signed on to help Ukraine in 1994 and it hasn't been upheld when they gave away their nuclear weapons. So I wonder, we know that Zelensky is incredibly apprehensive about giving up land. We know that this has now come down to this one issue. We've seen Steve Witkoff come out and say, look, the deal's 90% done, but this 10% isn't just 10%. This is one of the main issues that has always been the main issue. So I wonder if Zelensky and his team of delegates who have been in Abu Dhabi are approaching this as if security guarantees probably won't be signed off on. And in that case, we actually can't afford to be giving away anything.
To be clear, I don't think Witkoff is correct when he's talking about it being, 90% done. I think that's just nonsense. I think he's been led by the nose by the Russians since day one. He's not a smart man. Let's be clear. He shouldn't be doing the job that he's doing. And Russia has been very, very clear what they want, and these demands have not really changed that much since day one of the full-scale invasion, which is they want to demilitarize Ukraine. They want to replace the government. They call it denazification because they somehow believe that a Jewish president of Ukraine is a Nazi for some reason. They want to restore the status and privileges of Russian in Ukraine, which have never been removed, by the way, but Russia seems to believe that they have, despite Russia will tell you that Russian is banned, despite the fact that you can walk down any street in Kyiv and hear Russian being spoken openly. Half the military still speaks Russian. It's bizarre. But and they want to limit the Ukrainian military to a paltry amount to make any invasion, any subsequent invasion a lot easier. More recently, Putin was starting to talk about Novorossiya. So he was moving beyond just the Donbass. He was talking about Novorossiya, which means essentially, historically, Kyiv, Odessa, the Dnipro, Zaporizhia, parts of Ukraine like that. So it's this really naive view that Witkoff has of the Russians, and he's had it since day one, and it's why he's such a fundamentally unsuitable choice to be a negotiator, because he's just so credulous and just has no idea of the people he's dealing with. And also, sorry to slightly go off on a tangent there, but to come back to your point, I think the Ukrainian government is doing what they need to do to keep the Americans on side, to show to the Americans that they aren't the problem, that they're willing to agree to what the Americans are proposing, knowing almost certainly that the Russians will always never actually ultimately agree to what the Americans and the Ukrainians agree to, because the Russians will always want more, and that's always been the case.
Jimmy, just a final question and a slight pivot. I want to get your thoughts on something that happened this week. Trump's really been under fire with his allies. Of course, what happened with Greenland really kicked this off, but then specifically what he did this week was undermining the efforts of NATO troops who fought in Afghanistan alongside the United States. So he, in an interview with Fox News, basically said that these NATO troops stayed away from the front line, but then after so much backlash, he basically walked back to the comments. So he wrote that the great and very brave soldiers of the UK will always be with the US. In Afghanistan, 457 died. Many were badly injured, and they were among the greatest of all the warriors. The UK military is second to none except for the US. So, I mean, you're someone, as I mentioned before, who spends a lot of time with soldiers. What did you make of these comments? Because we saw various members of the UK government come out and basically say Trump needs to apologise. How dare he undermine the efforts of these soldiers across NATO countries who fought alongside the US. So, I mean, were you rattled by these comments, especially at a time where it seems as if, Trump is really isolating the US away from long-standing allies?
I wasn't rattled by them. They are part of the course with the Trump administration. J.D. Vance said something very, very similar a while back. And these people Trump is a draft dodger and a notorious coward. He's not someone that should be talking about bravery in any context. British troops fought valiantly in Afghanistan. I grew up in a military town, and I knew people that died in Afghanistan, as did many of my friends. And it's just obscene. It's absolutely obscene, but is exactly what you expect from these people. They are completely classless. And Trump says that British troops will always be alongside the United States. Well, keep going like this and you'll soon find out we won't be.
Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.